The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, and on a clear afternoon in March, you could see the whole Austin skyline from up there. I know this because I'd spent enough time in that room to memorize the view. I was not in that room on the afternoon my manager stood at the head of the table and told 12 senior leaders that she had spent the last 5 months reimagining the way our company thought about user experience. I found out about it the way I found out about most things at Callaway Digital. Secondhand in a hallway from a colleague named Remy, who had been in the room taking notes and came to find me afterward with an expression I still remember. Like he was carrying something he hadn't asked to carry. "She used your slides," he said, word for word, even the part about progressive disclosure. I didn't say anything for a long moment, I just nodded. Because here is what I already knew. I had 147 files on my laptop, time-stamped across 5 months of late nights and weekend mornings, and every single one of them had my name in the version history. I knew how this would end. I just didn't know yet when. My name is Reina Castillo, and at the time I was 29 years old, 2 years into a UX strategy role at Callaway Digital, a mid-sized SaaS company that built project management tools for mid-market businesses. I'd come up through research, user interviews, usability testing, the kind of slow, unglamorous work that most people in products skip over because it doesn't show up in the demo reel. I was good at it. Not in the way people say things like that to be modest and then wait for you to agree. I mean it plainly. The work I did was the kind that made products better in ways that users felt, but couldn't always name. My manager was Teresa. She'd been at Callaway for 11 years, longer than most of the company's current employees, and she had the easy confidence of someone who had outlasted enough reorganizations to know that presence often mattered more than product. She was smart in the way that counts in rooms with executives. She knew how to frame things, how to translate technical complexity into language that landed, how to make something sound visionary when the original idea had been sitting in a research document for months, waiting for someone to notice it. What she was not good at was the research itself, the sitting with data. The pattern recognition that takes hours of going through interview transcripts line by line until something quietly clicks. That was my job. And for 5 months it was also the best work I had ever done. It started in the fall when our core product, a workflow automation tool we called Streamline, started bleeding users. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, but the kind of slow attrition that shows up in cohort retention charts and quietly terrifies anyone who knows what they're looking at. Churn was up 14% year over year across our mid-market accounts. The revenue at risk was estimated at just over $3 million. Teresa came to me in October and said she needed me to figure out why. I spent 5 months figuring out why. I ran 26 user interviews across 4 customer segments. I built a behavioral mapping framework that tracked where users dropped off and what they told us, directly and indirectly, about why. I identified 3 core friction points in the onboarding experience, none of which had been flagged before, because nobody had looked at the qualitative signals alongside the quantitative data. I built a redesigned strategy from the ground up, a phased rollout plan, success metrics tied to real retention benchmarks, a prioritized backlog of design changes organized by impact and implementation cost. I brought it to Teresa in a one-on-one on a Thursday morning in February. I walked her through all of it, answered every question she had, even the ones that circled back to things I'd already explained. She asked me to send her the source files so she could review them over the weekend before we decided how to present it upward. I sent them, everyone. The following Wednesday, she presented my strategy to the executive leadership team as her own, without my name on a single slide. I want to be precise about what happened in the days after I found out, because I think people expect a certain kind of reaction, and what I actually did was almost nothing. I didn't go to HR. I didn't forward a single email. I didn't pull Remy aside and tell him to tell anyone anything. What I did was go home that evening, open a new folder on my external hard drive, and start organizing. Every email where I'd sent Teresa drafts of the research framework. Every Slack message where she'd asked me to walk her through the behavioral mapping methodology before she could contextualize it for leadership. Every Figma file with its version history intact, showing who had created each component and when. Every Google Doc with its edit timeline. I'd been working in a shared workspace, which meant every comment, every revision, every moment of authorship had a timestamp and a name attached to it. My name. My timestamps. I labeled the folder UX Research Archive Q4. Nothing clever. Just something that would mean nothing to anyone who accidentally saw it and everything to anyone who needed to understand what it contained. Then I went back to work. I want to explain that choice, because I know from the outside it can look like passivity. It wasn't. Confronting Teresa directly would have given her the chance to reframe the situation before I had any standing to counter it. I was 29. She had 11 years at this company and relationships with every executive in that building. If I walked into her office and said she'd taken credit for my work, the best outcome was a difficult conversation that resolved nothing. The worst outcome was getting labeled as difficult, territorial, not a team player, labels that have a particular stickiness when they get attached to women, and an extra particular stickiness when they get attached to women who are also the youngest person in the room. I was not going to give her that opening. So I waited, and while I waited, I kept building things. I took on a new research project in a different product area. I documented my process more obsessively than I ever had before. I built a reputation, quiet and consistent, as the person who made things work. Not the person who talked about making things work, but the person who actually delivered and left a clean paper trail every time. Teresa, meanwhile, was given a new title, Senior Director of Product Experience, and with it, a project. The project was called Northfield. It was a full redesign of the streamlined onboarding experience, built directly on top of the strategy I had created, extended into an 18-month initiative with a budget of $3.8 million and a team of 14 people reporting to her. She did not ask me to join. I didn't expect her to. I watched from a different floor of the building, in a different product area, doing excellent work and keeping my head down and listening when people talked. Callaway wasn't a large company. Things circulated. By month 4 of Northfield, I started hearing things. The engineering team was frustrated. They kept receiving design specs that had no research rationale behind them, which meant they couldn't make judgment calls when implementation ran into real-world constraints. The product was making decisions that contradicted the behavioral data I'd originally surfaced, because Teresa understood the conclusions without understanding the reasoning behind them. And when the conclusions hit friction, she had no way to adapt. By month 8, I heard from Remy that one of the vendors Teresa had brought in to build the new onboarding module had delivered work that didn't match what she'd promised the executive team. Something in the range of $400,000 in spend that hadn't produced what had been sold upward. By month 12, I heard that Northfield was 6 weeks behind schedule and that Desmond, our VP of Product, was asking hard questions in executive staff meetings. I said nothing, not to Remy, not to anyone. I kept my folder on my hard drive, kept doing my job, and I waited. The call came 16 months after the afternoon Teresa stood in the 14th floor conference room and said my research, my framework, my methodology. She said some version of my 22 times in 40 minutes. I know because I had Remy's notes. I always have the notes. Desmond asked me to come to his office, and I remember walking down that hallway, thinking about how many times I had rehearsed what I would say when this moment arrived. He didn't spend time on pleasantries. Desmond was the kind of person who made you feel like every minute had a cost. He said, "Northfield is in trouble. The onboarding redesign isn't working. Users are churning at higher rates than before we launched. We have an enterprise client conference in 9 weeks, and I have nothing to show them." He paused. Teresa tells me the original research framework came from her team. I want to bring someone from that early work back onto the project to stabilize it. She mentioned you were involved in the initial research phase. I let a silence settle between us. Not long, just enough. I wasn't involved in the initial research phase, I said. I conducted it. I designed the entire framework from scratch. I can show you exactly what I built and when I built it. His expression didn't change, but something behind it recalibrated. I'd be glad to come back onto Northfield, I said, but I want to come in as lead, design lead and UX strategy lead both. I want that in writing, with my name attached to the project documentation before I open a single file. He agreed without much deliberation. He was 9 weeks from an enterprise conference with a broken product. He would have agreed to a great many things. I said thank you, told him I'd have comments on the paperwork back to him by end of day, and stood up. Then, almost as an afterthought, though it was anything but, I'll also be sending you an email this afternoon. Some context I think you should have before we make anything official. He nodded. I walked out. The email wasn't long. 2 paragraphs. I had drafted it in my head roughly 11 months earlier and revised it maybe 100 times since. Not on paper, but in the back of my mind during team stand-ups, during morning runs along the trail by my apartment, during the kind of 3 a.m. wakefulness that I had mostly stopped fighting. I knew what it needed to say, and more importantly, what it didn't need to say. No accusations, no emotional language, no request for anything except for him to understand what he was working with. I attached the folder, all 147 files. The version histories, the timestamps, the Slack exports, the email chain, showing exactly when I'd sent Teresa the source files and what she'd said in response. The Figma history showing the creation date of every component, every annotation, every design decision. The Google Doc revision timeline going back to October. I let the metadata make the argument. I sent it at 4:17 in the afternoon and then went to the gym, which is the only productive thing I've found to do in the first hour after sending something you can't unsend. Teresa came to my desk the next morning. I saw her coming from about 30 feet away across the open floor plan, and I had enough time to finish what I was typing, set my hands in my lap, and decide how I wanted my face to look when she arrived. I chose neutral, not cold, just present. She was wearing a gray blazer, and her hair was pulled back the way she always wore it for difficult days. I had learned to read that tight pull the way you learn to read weather. She said she'd heard I was coming on to Northfield, and that was wonderful news, and that it had always been my research at the heart of the project. She'd always said so privately. I looked at her steadily. You said it was your research in the executive presentation 16 months ago, I said. You said my framework and my methodology and my findings. 22 times. I had the notes. A flicker crossed her face. Not guilt, exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been running a very long calculation and just found an error in the math. That's not how I remember it, she said. Desmond has the files now, I said. He can draw his own conclusions. She stood there longer than was comfortable. Then, in a voice that had shed most of its brightness, I'd like us to be able to move forward, work together the way we did before. I stood up, picked up my laptop bag because I had a 9 o'clock that actually mattered. We didn't work together before, Teresa, I said. You gave me assignments and presented the results as yours. That isn't collaboration. I walked to my meeting. She didn't follow. What happened over the next several weeks I will describe only briefly, because most of it unfolded without me. I was too busy actually fixing Northfield to observe the other thing in real time. An internal review was opened, one I was not part of except as a document source. The review found that Teresa had misrepresented the origins of the research framework in her original executive presentation, and that the vendor situation Remy had mentioned months earlier involved budget authorizations that had not gone through the proper approval channels. $400,000 in expenditures that should have had sign-off at the VP level and did not. She was placed on administrative leave 3 weeks after my conversation with Desmond. She resigned before the review concluded. 2 of the designers she'd hired for Northfield left in the following weeks. The ones who had stayed, the people who had been quietly struggling against unworkable specs without understanding why, turned out to be far more capable than anyone had given them credit for. They'd just been building without a foundation. Working from conclusions without the reasoning that generated those conclusions. So when the conclusions ran into walls, they had no map for navigating around them. I spent my first 2 weeks on the project doing nothing but sitting with those people. Listening to what they'd learned, what had broken, where their instincts had been right, and the documentation had failed them. They knew more than anyone had acknowledged. I brought back the original research and ran an updated round of sessions. 12 interviews over 3 weeks, to account for everything that had changed since the original work. I showed the team how to make decisions from data rather than from assumption. How to hold a design rationale in your head while you're building and use it when things don't go according to plan. We shipped the redesigned onboarding experience 7 weeks and 4 days after I formally came onto the project. Under the revised budget, not by a small margin, but by just over $110,000. The Enterprise Client Conference was in Nashville. I stood at the front of a room with about 200 people in it and presented the work, and I remember the exact quality of the light in that ballroom. The kind of bright artificial daylight that convention centers manufacture, And thinking about a specific Thursday morning nearly 2 years earlier, when I'd walked out of a one-on-one with Teresa, knowing something was wrong and not yet knowing what to do with that knowledge. After the presentation, a VP of operations from a logistics company in Memphis came up to me and said our onboarding redesign was the clearest, most intuitive he'd encountered in the project management space. He asked who had led the research and design strategy behind it. I did, I said. It was the first time I'd said those two words in a room that counted. Desmond was standing close enough to hear it. He said nothing in that moment. But 3 weeks later, at an all-hands meeting in front of the entire product organization, he spoke about the Northfield turnaround and said, and I am remembering this precisely, this outcome belongs to Raina. She built the foundation this company has been standing on for 2 years, and she came back and repaired it when we lost our way. I didn't say anything clever. I said thank you, and I meant it plainly, the way you mean things when the earning of them was long and mostly private. 8 months after Northfield shipped, I was promoted to Director of User Experience, youngest person to hold that title in the company's history. I still have the original research folder on my external hard drive, all 147 files, every timestamp intact. I haven't needed to open it in over a year. Remy told me, some months later, that Teresa had applied for senior roles at 2 other companies in the Austin market, and that in both cases the hiring teams had quietly reached out to Callaway for background and received answers that ended the conversations. I had nothing to do with that. The people at Callaway who gave those answers did so on their own, based on what they knew. The truth, once it's correctly attributed and given somewhere to land, doesn't need you to keep pushing it. I think about the women I manage now, 3 of them, all early in their careers, all doing the kind of foundational work that tends to disappear into someone else's slide deck. The first thing I tell each of them is the same thing I wish someone had told me before I walked into that one-on-one with my research and my trust. Document everything. Not because you expect to be wronged, because your work has value, and value deserves a record, and the record belongs to you. Keep your receipts. Keep your version histories. Keep the email that says, here are the source files, sent on a Sunday night in February, 2 years before anyone was ready to look at it. I waited 16 months for the right door to open. And when it did, everything I had quietly built, the evidence, the reputation, the expanded capability that came from being kept off the project that should have been mine and having to grow in a different direction instead. All of it was already waiting on the other side, ready. The loudest person in any room I have ever stood in was never the one who built the thing worth talking about. The builder tends to be quieter, more patient, usually sitting at a desk somewhere nearby with a folder of documentation and a very long view. I was that person for 16 months. I am still that person now. The difference is that this time the room has my name on the door.